everyone. I'm Fabio Taccone from Brussels, and I will discuss with you today about the use of CO2 removal devices in critically ill patients. So we talk about carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is mainly carried by the plasma as dissolved bicarbonates. And the content of CO2 into the blood is not only dependent on the pressure of CO2, but also on the pH and other factors like hemoglobin, oxygen saturation. And the difference is that 100 milliliters of arterial blood carries 20-25 milliliters of oxygen, while they carries up to 50 to 60 milliliters of CO2. So the quantity of CO2, which includes the free part and dissolved part, is extremely high. Why I'm telling you this? Because when you apply this concept to the use of extracorporeal removal of CO2, and of course extracorporeal oxygenation of the blood, when the extracorporeal device takes the place of the injured lungs, it's quite easy to remove CO2 with quite low blood flow. You don't need to treat a lot of flow for the patients to remove CO2. While the elimination is dependent on the gradient on CO2 between the membrane and the blood of the patient. So the highest is the gas flow you apply to the patients, the highest is the capacity of the device to remove CO2. Now, if you use the conventional VV ECMO, which is a device able to go up to 5 liters per minute with a double or single lumen cannulation, you can basically remove 100% of your CO2. Now, why we should use a device that is dedicated only to CO2 removal? Because the technology has allowed now the availability of membranes that are able to highly exchange gases for the new configuration, so they can remove a very high quantity of CO2. They are biocompatible and they are coated, which means that this biocompatibility is increased and there is decreased risk of clotting. Now, it's not really non-invasive because, of course, you have to cannulate the patient, but it's an alternative way to treat patients where the problem is not oxygenation anymore, but basically is removal of CO2 and treating respiratory acidosis. And this is what we have on the market. So you can choose either a veno-venous cannulation, again with a single or double catheter, and you can select the blood flow between 250 and 800 milliliters, or using an arteriovenous system, again with a double cannulation, up to go to a maximum of a liter per minute. So the big difference between with the ECMO is that the amount of flow you have to use is much lower, because as I told you, the content of CO2 in the blood is very high. You can easily remove CO2 not treating in a high flow of the patient. And the removal of CO2 is quite important. You can remove up to 40 to 50% of the entire CO2 of the patient. Of course, this device will not provide any oxygenation to your patient. This is true if you see some data in humans. On the up part of the slides, you see here the amount of CO2 removed by a CO2 removal device, and you see that the quantity of CO2 removed is increasing by increasing the gas flow, and the maximum is reached around 8 to 10 liters per minute. You can obtain the same by increasing also the blood flow of the device, but basically this shows you that just playing with the gas flow, if you have a very low blood flow, 1 liters, you are able to remove a high quantity of CO2. And when we talk about the literature about the threshold, these devices should be able to remove at least 50 milliliters per minute of CO2. Now, which are the applications of this technique that has been introduced already in 78 by Gattinoni, has been evolving over time? I will discuss today, for the sake of time, only about two main indications. One is patients with ARDS, and the second are decompensated COPD patients. Of course, you can also use this intervention in other situations like asthma, thoracic surgery, and bridge to lung transplantation. So in ARDS, the concept is quite simple. Mechanical ventilation is life-saving, but this intervention can also worsen lung injury because you provide high tidal volume or high transpulmonary pressure. If you want to reduce volume and transpulmonary pressure, the risk is that, of course, you reduce the ventilation lung injury, but you will increase CO2 because you reduce the minute ventilation. So in the situation where ARDS is complicated by hypercapnia, we know now that extracorporeal CO2 devices are able, like in this study, to reduce CO2 from PCO2 from 100 milliliters of mercury or around 55. This has been repeatedly shown in different clinical studies. But the question is, if you want to be very protective, you could sometimes even reduce further the tidal volume from 6 cc per kilograms, which is recommended to the guidelines, to 5, even 4 cc per kilograms, according to some cohorts where lower than standard tidal volume were associated with even lower risk of mortality. Now, if you do this, if you apply this ultraprotective lung ventilation, you need to apply concomitantly a CO2 removal device to keep a normal pH and to avoid CO2 accumulation. The first studies applying this concept were quite disappointing. This is a systematic, it's not a systematic, it's a review published in the Current Opinion in Critical Care, revising main studies looking at the use of CO2 removal devices in ARDS patients. You see the mortality rate was very high. Of course, these are very sick patients. Most of these bypass were VV. And only in one study from Gattinoni and co-workers, there was a total lung rest, which means the device was full supporting gas exchange of the patients and where patients was totally apneic. So you see how concomitantly to CO2 removal devices, the ventilator strategies were very different. What we have observed in these studies is clear you can reduce the tidal volume, you can reduce the driving pressure, you can reduce the PCO2, but the number of complications you observe is extremely high. Imagine you want to buy a new device and the company tells you it's very effective, but 50% of your patients will have a complication. You will probably never invest in this kind of technology. And of course, when you see the dates of publication, you realize that these were old technologies, and new technologies have probably different results. About new studies, this is a German study randomizing patients to either conventional ventilator strategy in ARDS or a very low tidal volume, 3 cc per kilograms, together with CO2 removal devices. And in this study, including almost 80 patients, which was early stop because of some problems of recruitment, you see that in those patients where PO2 FiO2 ratio was low, less than 150 millimeters of mercury, the use of this, let's say, experimental approach, very low tidal volume and CO2 removal devices, was associated with a lower interleukin-6 into the bulb, a lower diving pressure, and so which means that probably you were really providing an ultra-protective ventilator strategies in these patients. The number of complications was reasonable, 8%, but there were more transfusions in the group receiving CO2 removal devices. In another Italian studies, also using a more modern technology for CO2 removal devices, you see that again, the application of this ultra-protective lung ventilation, which is reducing tidal volume from 6 to 4 cc per kilograms, was able to reducing plateau pressures, so transpulmonary pressure, and of course, able to control CO2 and pH. Again, in this study, there was no difference in mortality. The cohort was so small. You see that there is an improvement in lung hyperinflation using CT scan, and again, a reduction of inflammation because you are providing an ultra-protective lung ventilation. There were some complications, again, technical complication, maybe clotting, again, showing that this technology is not perfect yet, and you should be very careful when you apply these technologies in your patients. The last study I want to show you is the Supernova study, which basically is a confirmation of the previous one, multicentric study with the 3 different devices to eliminate CO2. And you see that again, these are data show at the baseline, 8 hours, 24 hours observation. You are able in this large cohort to provide ultra-protective lung ventilation with a quite a reasonable number of complications, mainly mechanical, 14% clotting, and some bleeding, but not severe in 14% of cases. In COPD, the question is different because in COPD, we know that we have to avoid mechanical ventilation. There is a very good way to avoid it, which is the use of non-invasive ventilation, which is the standard of care in the treatment of decompensated COPD patients. But in patients where the use of non-invasive ventilation is prolonged, or those who fail non-invasive ventilation, the question is, does CO2 removal, extracorporeal CO2 removal, is helpful to reduce the need of mechanical ventilation, or when you go to mechanical ventilation, facilitate the weaning? Just rapidly, want to show you some studies. This is an Italian study. No one of these studies really randomized, at least some of the one I will show you. This is a study comparing the use of CO2 removal to an historical control of patients who are treated with non-invasive ventilation. And the question of the researcher is, can CO2 removal prevent intubation? You see that in the group of people treated with NIV plus ECCO2rE, you have an improvement in pH and a reduction of CO2. This is expected. And the proportion of patients who required mechanical ventilation was reduced from 33% non-invasive ventilation alone to 12% when you apply ECCO2rE. So it's a very promising results. Of course, you apply a therapy in some patients who will never need mechanical ventilation. The number of complications was quite low. The other study is a randomized trial, again, discussing the same idea. Can we prevent intubation in these patients? And you see that again, the approach was effective. You have a reduction almost significant in tracheostomy, although the effect on mortality was not so evident. But again, this therapy do not cure the underlying disease, it just allow you to more rapidly be weaned by mechanical ventilation. And the level of complication in this study was quite low, 44%, which might explain the lack of differences in outcome. Can we more easily wean COPD patients when they are ventilated using the ECCO2rE? It's again the question in this study, where again comparing with historical control of patients with COPD failing non-invasive ventilation, they applied ECCO2rE after the implementation of mechanical ventilation. They showed in this study that you are able to improve CO2, increase pH, reduce respiratory rates, and of course, you have most of the patients who have been weaned from mechanical ventilation. Interestingly, in this study, probably because you can wean these patients more rapidly, although there is no effect on mortality, you can significantly reduce the number of tracheostomies. So interesting results in terms of morbidity of the patients more than mortality. And this is again a systematic review discussing most of the studies that I've shown you. Basically, the extracorporeal CO2 removal devices are effective. They can reduce the need of mechanical ventilation in COPD patients, favor extubation more rapidly. At the time today, we have no studies big enough to show any effect on mortality. This is the ongoing research in this setting. One thing that is again very important to show you is that even in COPD patients, maybe even more in COPD patients, you need to, of course, optimize the use of mechanical ventilation, which means you start to use the ECCO2rE not 1 hour after, but maybe, let's say 1 day after the fail of the weaning of mechanical ventilation using standard approach. And then the flow that you use, the blood flow of the device, cannot be 300 milliliters per minute. It should be 1 liter, 1.5 liters in some cases, to provide enough CO2 removal to wean these patients. So again, the characteristics of the device are also very important to make the device effective in this situation. So which bring now to the question, if you want to use ECCO2rE in your patients, how to define the optimal setting, which is the optimal device you want to use. My personal opinion is that veno-venous configuration is better than arteriovenous. You know that in arteriovenous configuration, you need a difference in pressure from the arterious to the venous side to make the pump, to make the system work, because there is basically no pump. So you cannot use this device in patients who have a very low blood pressure, because the difference is not enough to make an adequate flow through the device, or in patients with elevated PVC, because, for example, of abdominal distension. And there is a risk of distal limb ischemia because you are cannulating, of course, the femoral artery. The other point is the cannulation. If you want a device like CO2 removal device to be effective, clearly cannulation is fundamental. You can use a double lumen cannula. You can use a single lumen cannula. In my hospital, we use a lot of single lumen cannula because of matter of money. But if you have the possibility, you can use double lumen cannula because you need a caliber first. You cannot use too small catheter because then the flow will be very limited. And you need catheters that are developed to support extracorporeal devices, not dialysis. Because if you increase the blood flow and your catheter is not reinforced like here, it will collapse and you will work in very low blood flow, which is not effective to remove CO2. So independently from the number of cannula, you need the adequate cannula to make your system work. And the third point, which is very relevant to me, is the use of blood flow. So I would say that the blood flow that you need to provide to your patients, if you want an effective CO2 removal, it's at least 600 to 800, either 1 milliliter, 100 to 1,000 milliliter per minute. This is more effective than low flow CO2 removal, which means you cannot use an ART dialysis to make it for good reasons. And the good reasons, in my opinion, are very good shown in this paper, which is a secondary analysis of the Supernova studies. I told you there were some patients receiving different devices, 1/3 of them receiving a lower CO2 extraction, which means low flow, 400 milliliters per minute, and 2/3 receiving high CO2 extraction, which means around 100 milliliters to 1,000 milliliters per minute. And you see that the higher CO2 extraction is more effective first in terms of PCO2, so in CO2 extraction. This is, of course, expected, but more importantly, there were less hemolysis and less bleeding in the patients with the high flow, which means if you're using the low flow CO2 extraction, you are less effective to remove CO2 or you have more complication. So how the technology helps us? There are now devices like the CO2 reset from Aeroset that we're starting to use that is only developed to provide CO2 removal. It's not an ECMO device. It has been designed only for CO2 removal. Like all the new devices, this requires preclinical validation, and we have finished very small study in 3 pigs, healthy pigs in the lab, where we have validated a system where you add the CO2 to the pig, so you induce hypercapnia, and then you apply an extracorporeal CO2 removal, CO2 reset, and you calculate the amount of CO2 that is eliminated by the device. And you see very easily that by increasing the gas flow from 0 to 2 to 3, you exceed 100 milliliters per minute. So the system is very effective to remove CO2 from these healthy animals. Of course, you may say, these are animals, does it work in humans? We have some first in human cases. This 60-year-old man suffering from COPD was admitted in my hospital for decompensated COPD, treated by, first-line therapy, bronchodilators, corticosteroids. He was on non-invasive ventilation, and then, this was his clinical status, not so well. He failed non-invasive ventilation. He was finally intubated after 38 hours since admission. And what we decided is to implement this system into the patient. Is a quite, original cannulation. We drain the blood from the subclavian vein on the left side, and re-inject the blood into the jugular right side with cannula around 15 French. Those are not big cannula, very easy to insert. This will provide the expected 800 milliliters per minute of blood flow. And in the next slide, you see this is the flow. This is the initial gas flow, 0. This is the pH. This is in orange, the PCO2. And this is the evolution over time after 1 hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, just increasing the gas flow from 2 to 3 to 5.5 liters. And you see how after 6 hours, your patient is a 736 pH and 40 PCO2. You basically have totally normalized gas exchanges in these patients, which were finally extubated 2 days after the initiation of mechanical ventilation and discharged home after 2 weeks. The total VSCO2 removal in these patients ranged from 42 milliliters per minute at the beginning up to more than 100. So again, very effective CO2 removal from the device. The second case we treated more recently in the period that was a COVID-19 patients was a mechanical ventilation on day 2. and who was already on protective lung ventilation. You see here the total volume, C milliliters per kilograms, plateau pressure with the PEEP of 8, quite high driving pressure to keep these very horrible gas exchanges with a very high respiratory rate. This is the chest X-ray. This is totally perfectly stable patients with a persistent respiratory acidosis. We decided to implement the device in this patient. And again, like the previous patient, you see this is the gas flow, 800 milliliters, the first pH, 730, the first PCO2, 81, and we increased the gas flow to 2.5 to 5 to 7 up to 22 liters per minute, which is a little bit unexpected because you will say that after 7 to 8 liters there will be a plateau of CO2 removal. In these patients, we're still able to remove CO2, and after 15 hours, you see the gas exchange 735, 45 with a VCO2 maximum up to 289 milliliters per minute, which is very huge in terms of CO2 removal, so highly effective in these patients to remove CO2. Of course, this is not perfect. There are still questions that the bestial limitation, whatever is the device you want to use. Your patient should not have some active bleeding because you need to anticoagulate the filter. You cannot work without any anticoagulation. There is no citrate, no local anticoagulation possible up to date, and there are still questions on how to monitor anticoagulation. There are still the question of hypoxemia. Your patient is not hypoxemic, but can he become hypoxemic thereafter? And if you use a very small cannula, how to convert a CO2 removal device to a full VV ECMO? What about concomitant renal failure? Because you cannot combine CRT and a high flow, but you can probably do it because, for example, in CO2 reset, you have a part of the device which is at least scheduled to provide ultrafiltration. And then the duration of therapy. This therapy is validated 5 to 7 days. What about longer therapies? What about changing the filters? These are questions remain open to be discussed. And one question that I think is sometimes totally forgotten is that if you apply this device, you should measure the amount of CO2 removal in these patients. You can do it with different possibilities. You can use, for example, the measurement at the level of the device. You can use specific monitoring system. You can use gas exchanges before and after the filter. The CO2 reset, for example, that I'm using now has been implemented in device system, able to measure directly the CO2 removal from the device, which is very, very effective and important in these patients. So I'd like to conclude with this last slide, which is basically a summary of what I told you. The use of CO2 removal is still in a very early phase because we know that you can do many good things. You can reduce tidal volume. You can prevent intubation in some patients. You can facilitate extubation. Maybe in the future is a way to favor the bridge to lung transplantation in some selected patients. There are literature in ARDS patients. There is literature in COPD patients. I'll try to show you the main studies. There are many questions today on how to optimize this concept into your clinical practice. And I try to make you available some questions you need to provide yourself on how to select the device, which are basically related to, is the device able to provide enough blood flow, which is enough of blood flow is equal high CO2 extraction. I need to use the adequate cannula because the adequate cannula is mandatory to have the blood flow and to make the system work as effective as possible. And then different practical questions, how to monitor CO2, how to monitor anticoagulation to make your system be the most effective to treat your patients. Thanks a lot.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Mirko Belliato. I'm an intensivist and I work as an ECMO expert in the Pavia Hospital, a small town in the north of Italy. So this is my disclosure of the last 5 years, and I would like in the next 20 minutes to talk about the new ECMO device, but I have to start with which is on the market now. So when a perfusionist asks me how to select an appropriate ECMO device, these are my point. I would like to have the best technology available on the market. The device must be safety The oxygenator included in the kit must be adequate with adequate performance. The circuit must be flexible, user-friendly, easy to use, and very simple to understand what's happened. And the sensoristic it's very important and must be very simple to use. And the last but not the least, the machine should be transportable and easy to use inside hospital, at the bedside, or on the ambulance. So that's all? No, because the requirement for a centrifugal blood pumps are important, like the biological characteristics, biocompatibility, the priming volume, lower as possible. The connectors must be very strong and also the performance are not to be neglected, because we have to understand the hydraulic performance of our pumps, the flow rate maximum, the pressure generated, the shearing force that are generated by the pump, because the blood can be damaged by the centrifugal pump, and we have to measure the plasma-free hemoglobin, the platelet reductions. Also, the white blood cell reduction is an index of inflammatory reaction caused by the pumps. And the bearing durability. If you use an ECMO for 6 hours, it's totally different than if you use the same for 15 days. On the market now there are more or less four types of centrifugal pump. A roller pump that is used for the cardiopulmonary bypass, and I would not talk about this. The axial, the diagonal, and the centrifugal pump. So the centrifugal pumps are now preferred to the roller pumps because they have a longer life and less hemolysis. And it's very important to focus on this. If you want to do an ECMO support plus than 6 hours, 8 hours, use a centrifugal pump. I would like to talk about the centrifugal and the diagonal. Centrifugal pump on the market with the pivot bearing are the three type. The more old is the impeller one on the left, with this shape that you can see, and with a paddle principle like the Terumo one. Second type, there is the shrouded channel. You can see in the middle of the slide with the flow channel, a principal flow channel like the Giostra from the Macche, and the vortex one with the different shape and different bearing and pivot system, and the principal channel also in the if you cut the head of the pump, you can see inside different impeller channels, and this is a three-dimensional view of the relative velocity distribution inside the impeller channels. That depends from the blade inside the pumps, and more is higher the speed. Higher is the speed. Higher is the shearing forces applied to the red blood cell, and probably higher is the damage to the red blood. So also the shape of the blade inside. Here you can see a graph in which are compared three types of blade inside the head of the pump. One is 16 blade, 16 4 straight blade, and 18 blade. you can see that the best at the normal flow rate of 5 is the tape with the 8 backward bending blade. So in a practical way, if you want to choose the best in head of pump, you have to check that the blade should be backward bending blade to reduce the damage to the. This is a back blade. You can see here a scale of the velocity magnitude inside the head of the pumps, and you can see that in the middle of the impeller the flow is very, very low, and there are vortex. That means that the blood can make thrombus in the middle, and at the top, at the arrow of the blade, you can see very high speed, and this formula gives us the magnitude of the hemolysis created by this high-speed vortex. So this is another point to understand which is the best head of pump that you can choose for your patient. This is another kind of centrifugal pump available on the market from different companies, more or less 4. There are 4 different, and with 4 different solutions. With all these have a pivot inside, so there is the same concept that I explained before, with vortex, high-speed vortex at the top of the blade, low-speed vortex in the middle near the pivot inside the pump. You can see here, and in the middle of the head of pump there is risk of thrombosis, and in the peripheral of the head of pump there is a risk of damage of the red blood cells, means hemolysis. If you compare the roller pump, the very old roller pump, the Biomedicus pump, the Rotaflow pump in the quite old paper like this, you can find that the Rotaflow pump, the last this year version of a head of pump, is better respect the others in terms of free. Without any lower risk of hemolysis. If you compare this new technology with the previous technology, with the pivot, you can see here that the full levitating pump have a very low plasma free hemoglobin respect to the other pumps. So the advantage of using a magnetic levitation centrifugal pump is to eliminate particle heat generation, because there is no attritum, no touch between a solid part of the pump. Reduce the hemolysis for the reason of the low vortex, reducing thrombus, no zone without the appropriate speed of the blood, and lower risk of mechanical failure, because there is no bearing. What is the new advances on the market? This is a very interesting pump, because you can see here is very thin, slim, and full magnetic levitating pump. The very small priming volume. There is no beer, And if you compare this pump, this new kind of pump, the name is ECMO Life, with the best pump on the market, the name is Levitronics, you can find that the ECMO Life have a very good performance, because the total pressure with very high flow rate, it's more or less equal than the best on the market, and you can keep very high pressure also in a very high flow, like 10 liters per minute. And what about free hemoglobin? This is the real benchmark. With the ECMO Life, you can see the blue line, the free hemoglobin. After hours, it's better than the other companies. This is the free hemoglobin compared with the previous technology, the Rotaflow one, that it is dramatically better than the other pumps. What about fluid velocity? The same? No. You can see here the low sharing stress generation, low hemolysis, and a better pressure distribution inside the head of the pump. That means very low heat generation and absence of stagnation area. This is the head of pump plus the engine. You can see here it's very small. The pump is innovation and innovative idea. There is nothing like this on the market. Only 39 ml of priming with a rotor diameter of 50 millimeters and the flow range from 0 to 10. That's all? No, because I need a very high technology, but this technology must be user-friendly. So I would like to go to the CT scan, to the cath lab, or on ambulance, or on helicopters, or on the airplane for flying my patient. And I need a compact and simple to transport device, and this is the final result of the ECMO Life. The ECMO Life is a concept, is perfect for the transport, because you can have the head of pump protected and near to the console, the oxygenator ultra protected and very tied to the console, and you can see on the screen all the data that you need. So in a portable machine you can obtain a full magnetic levitation technology and a second pump. Yes, because you have a backup integrated. A backup unit means a second rotor, a second flow meter, and if something happens, you can have a second pump with you in the same chassis, plus all the mandatory pressure, saturation, hemoglobin, temperature parameters that you have to obtain during your ECMO support. Obviously, you can have a set dedicated for this pump, and you can customize if you want. It's 14 days validated, phosphorine coated tip to tip, also the oxygenator, a trolley for inter-hospital or intra-hospital that fit with any kind of stretcher, and external battery power bank for obtain more power if you need to do very long transport. This is a screenshot of the pumps with all the parameters: drainage pressure, pressure before the oxygenator, pressure after the oxygenator, drainage, saturation, blood of the blood, hemoglobin, temperature, bubbles. Yes, there is the bubbles sensor. These are the two pumps integrated. One pump is on the left, is the primary one, and the second pump is the backup. Also, the backup have a small display for control the backup. And this is the circuit fixing plate. This is a totally new idea on the market, because the oxygenator is connected with the pumps, but you can move this plate from the back of the machine to one to side of left or side right, depends if you like, if you need, if your stretcher needs to stay on the left or on the right, or move the plate if you have the trolley like this, and move the plate on the trolley. That's all. No, because this pump, it's a VAD, validated support. You can ask for the circuit set without oxygenator, and you can use the pump as a VAD. And you don't need a second pump, because the second pump is still integrated inside. So, the out point of a new ECMO system is the fully magnetic levitation technology, the most advanced technology for moving blood worldwide on the market. A backup integrated unit means a second pump inside. There are sensors for all kind of needs. There is a dedicated ECMO set, and you can make in safe way transport or stay in the hospital with a. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. University and a very huge hospital, and I work as ECMO expert. I'm a physician. So I start to talk with you about the monitoring with the typical scenario where the monitor of the heart-lung machine was born. This is a cardiopulmonary bypass, which is applied a device, the name is landing, that give in real time 21 parameters able to provide information regarding the transport of the oxygen, the consumption of the oxygen, and more other parameters like the venous saturation, arterial saturation, the drop pressure between the oxygen fibers, the drainage pressure, and other interesting parameters like the total vascular resistance and so on. This is because we are in artificial condition, and if we consider a normal patient with heart and the lungs, the normal patient it's like a factory that produces CO2 and consumes oxygen, and the cardiac output given by the heart and the oxygen given by the lungs sustain the metabolism of the patient. During a cardiopulmonary bypass, the heart and the lungs of the patient are totally bypassed. So we have to monitor the gas exchange done by the oxygenator plus the circulatory support given by the pumps for give to the patient the adequate oxygen intake and remove the adequate amount of CO2. So this is why we need a precise and reliable monitor of the cardiopulmonary bypass machine, not only in terms of total blood flow or total oxygen given, but also about the pressures, about the total content of oxygen given by the machine. So we can, if we like to use equation, this is a very simple equation because the oxygen delivery given by the cardiopulmonary bypass must be equal to the oxygen consumption of the patient. The same for the CO2. The CO2 removal done by the cardiopulmonary bypass must be equal to the CO2 production of the patient. During ECMO support, this condition is a little bit more complicated because we have in series the ECMO machine, means membrane lung and ECMO pump, plus the heart of the patient. So we have to take in consideration both the native organs, natural lungs and natural heart, plus the membrane lungs and the volumetric pump, the centrifugal pump. So the total delivery of oxygen during an ECMO support is given by the oxygen amount released by the ECMO machine plus the delivery of the oxygen by the residual capacity of the lung and the heart of the patient. So the same equation of before is a little bit complicated because the consumption of oxygen should be equal to the VO2 membrane lung plus the VO2 native. So the total intake of oxygen of a patient during a VV ECMO is due to the VO2 native lung that is equal to the cardiac output multiplied to the content of oxygen in between the native lung, the arterial oxygen content minus the venous mixed oxygen content, and the VO2 membrane lung is equal to the blood flow multiplied to the content of oxygen that go out from the oxygenator minus the content of oxygen that go inside the. This is a practical example of what's happened in a patient if you monitor during the day the total VO2. With the yellow line you can see the total VO2 that we given to our patient, and the green line is the native lung, the red line is the membrane lung. You can see in the day one the major part of the oxygen was given by the membrane lung. At the opposite, at the end of the ECMO support during the weaning, the major part of the oxygen support was given by the native lung and not by the membrane lung. This is due to the recovery of the native lung, and the physician could reduce the support in terms of oxygen content inside. How to obtain this so important information? Some years ago we started with an Excel-based spreadsheet in which we put in all the parameters from the blood gas analysis, from the console of the ECMO, from the patient, to obtain this data that you can see. But the calculation was not really simple because there are to calculate the content of oxygen inside the blood of the ECMO machine. And the second point is that this calculation is not continuous, but it's point to point. You can do it 1 time, 2 times, or 3 times per day. Which is the step forward? Is obtain this measurement continuously using a device. This is a type of device available on the market. The name is Landing, in which you can measure the VO2 membrane lung continuously. How to do it? Using a probe and a flow meter. These 2 probes are one venous and one arterial or post-oxygen oxygenator probe that the content of oxygen using the formula of saturation without any sample of blood. It's a not invasive measurement of content of oxygen. Obviously you can obtain only the content of oxygen linked with the hemoglobin, because you know that the calculation is based on invasive sample and include also the dissolved oxygen. Here is the more or less the ratio between the oxygen linked to the hemoglobin and the oxygen transported dissolved in the plasma. If the 98% of oxygen is transported through the hemoglobin, only the 2% is dissolved in the plasma. If you keep a normal PaO2 of 100, means that 98 millimeter of mercury of oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen is linked with is transported by the hemoglobin. Only 2 millimeter of mercury is transported by the dissolved plasma. Obviously, if you go to 500 millimeter of mercury or kilopascal of partial pressure of oxygen, this amount. Where I can find this data on the screen? Here you can find the VO2 membrane length given by the machine, and how to manage this value. If we need to increase the VO2, means I need to support more my patient in terms of oxygen, I have to increase the blood flow, not because the gas flow don't increase a lot the content of oxygen. It's the blood flow the most important. Here is a patient in which we measure for 25 days continuously the VO2, and you can find here a very strange increase of the value. It's due to the septic shock condition in which the patient followed and we needed to increase the content of oxygen, we increase the blood flow, increase the hemoglobin with transfusion to support the patient metabolism. So this is just a short memories about what you can do during the ECMO support. If you find any problems like decreased saturation, you can increase the ECMO flow, you can increase the hemoglobin, you can increase the saturation if you don't have 100% of your gas mixer, and or you have to reduce the metabolism of the patient. If your patient have a fever, you can use the antipyretics. For example, if your patient is shivering, using meperidine, dexmedetomidine, to reduce the metabolism of the patient. What about the carbon dioxide? It's equal. During ECMO, you have the native lung and the membrane lung that remove carbon dioxide, and the total CO2 removal must be equal to the removal done by the membrane lung plus the removal done by the native lung. Here you can see the equation about this concept. On the left, the CO2 removal must be equal to the right part of the equation, that is the CO2 reduction. So, how to do it? This is the equation for measurement and calculation of VCO2 membrane lung. This is the content of CO2 multiplied 10 multiply the blood flow. It's a little bit complicated, but there is non-invasive method that is not based on the blood sample. One method was described by our group and is the measurement of the concentration of CO2 in the exhaust gases from the oxygenator with a very simple equation. Gas flow multiply the percentage of CO2 that goes out from the oxygenator. How to do it? Using a flow meter and a capnometer applied to the ECMO machine. You can see on the right panel of the slides. Here, if you apply a flow meter and a capnometer, your result is a graph like this. It's a concentration of CO2 during a time that is multiply the volume of gas that goes out from the oxygenator. So the equation is the CO2 membrane lung. It's equal to the concentration of CO2 multiply the gas flow multiply 10. This is a study published 2 years ago in which we validated the calculation of the CO2 removal with this method. On the screen you can find both this number. One is the gas flow and another one is the percentage of CO2 eliminated. And you can find on the top, you can see here the total amount of CO2 eliminated by your oxygenator. You can see here that is 112, for example, in this patient with a percentage of 4.3 and a gas flow of 2.6. This is very interesting because you can understand during, for example, 3-4 days of continuous ECMO support, which is the capability of your ECMO to remove CO2, and which is the interaction between the native lung and the membrane. Because if you have a volumetric capnometer applied to the patient lungs, that is made by a capnometer and a flow meter, it's equal than the visor used on the ECMO, you can create, this is an example of a machine that provides this kind of, you can obtain a graph similar of the patient with the total VCO2 native lung. And the total VCO2 native lung is the alveolar ventilation multiply the concentration of CO2 in the alveolar air. And if you combine these two values, the membrane lung CO2 elimination and the native lung CO2 elimination during an ECMO support, you can understand what the lungs of the patient do during the ECMO support in terms of CO2 elimination. This is a patient, the clinical case published 2 or 3 years ago, in which we monitored these two parameters. You can see in the beginning, the day 0, the day 1, the major part of the workload of removal CO2 was done by the red line, means the blue line means the membrane lung. The native lung, the red line, don't do a lot of job. That is the opposite of the day 10, when we disconnect the patient from the oxygenator. We disconnect the patient from the oxygenator, from the ECMO machine, because the native lung, the line red, increased a lot. That means that the patient had a recovery. The lung of the patient recovered. and the support given by the membrane lung was reduced because don't need it. This is another example of a patient in which we measure continuously the native lung and membrane lung CO2 removal, and you can see during 31 days of ECMO support there was no recovery from the native lung, and all the work of removal CO2 was done by the machine, by the ECMO machine. So this patient died on ECMO for not recovered lung function. We can say more. Yes, if you consider a ratio between native lung and total VCO2, that is the sum between native lung plus membrane lung, you cannot. And this ratio maybe, I'm not sure because we are studying this as an index of winning capability of the patient. When your patient, or better, when the index or the ratio increase, means that the native lung start to recover, probably you can remove your ECMO support when the treasure is more or less 50 or 60%. This is a typical patient in which the ratios always still remain under 10. There is no recovery from the lung. So this is the chest X-ray of the patient, and the patient died on ECMO because there was no recovery. This is another patient in which you can see at the day 46 a recovery, and the patient was successful with ECMO. Where I can find these two parameters, the VO2 and the VCO2 membrane lung on the screen, you can see here it's exactly in the middle of the screen, in this upper part, and you can have under your eyes continuously, day by day, minute by minute, the performance of your oxygenator in terms of VO2 and in terms of VCO2. But this number give us more information? Probably yes, because when an oxygenator starts not to be so performant, what's happened? Some fibers are not ventilated and increase the extracorporeal shunt, like a native lungs, increase the extracorporeal shunt, and the effective blood flow is reduced. You calculate the extracorporeal membrane or membrane lung shunt with this equation, you can find that day by day this number. But we can do it every day by every day? Probably no. So we need a more simple method, and we try to use the VO2 as a index of the shunt. In this patient, we measure for 40 days, the VO2 membrane lung, and we compare the number with the theoretical performance given by the company. The black line is the theoretical performance of the oxygenator. The green dot are the value of VO2 membrane lung in the first 14 days, and the red one is the VO2 membrane lung after the 15 days. You can see that after the first days of works, the oxygenator reduces performance. And you can see on the screen of your machine, of your landings, this concept. You can see where your patient is in that day compared to the theoretical performance of the oxygenator. This is for a Euroset oxygenator. The theoretical line is referred to the Euroset oxygenator ECMO, and you can understand if you are far or close to the theoretical actual performance. The same is for the CO2 elimination, because after several days of work, some part of the fiber are close to the blood. And this is the name of this phenomenon is membrane lung dead space. So the effective gas flow is reduced. To measure, it's equal. If you measure the VCO2 membrane lung and you compare the VCO2 membrane lung with the theoretical performance given by the companies, you can obtain the percentage of performance, residual percentage of performance of your oxygenator. These are two different oxygenator theoretical curve, and the green is the first 15 days and the red is after 15 days of use. And you can see that the green is more near to the. This is our C7 oxygenator, in which we measure the ratio between the theoretical performance and the actual performance. So, as a conclusion, you can find all these parameters: VO2 membrane lung, VCO2 membrane lung, VCO2 ratio. If you can put inside manually, at this moment manually, the VO2 native lung from your ventilator, and you can monitor the performance of your article. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.